I can't be the only one who grew up in a small town with a few resident creeps. I'm not talking about criminals or stalkers. I'm talking about those people who live in the house on the hill, or at the end of the street. The people that everyone knows about, but nobody actually knows. Everyone else in town seems to agree that something is not quite right about them. They never even have visitors. I'm sure you know the type. When I was a little kid, I spent a great deal of time at my grandparents' farm in the foothills of North Carolina. I would explore all around their property, and most of the neighbors would let me explore their lands too. However, there was one man who lived a few miles from the farm, whom my grandparents warned me about, saying that I should never go near, and the neighbors all agreed something about him was a little bit off. The exact reasons people cited were varied, ranging from PTSD to an escapee from a mental asylum, but nobody could say for sure exactly what his problem was. I always followed my grandparents' advice, and I never knocked on the door of the elegant two-story farmhouse where the mysterious man lived. But I nevertheless found myself standing in front of that old farmhouse back in November of last year. I'm a machinist by trade, but sometimes I work odd jobs on the side for some extra cash. I often do jobs using heavy machinery, mostly grading driveways or digging drainage ditches. So when I got a call asking about what my rate would be for removing about a dozen large tree stumps, I was excited at the prospect of an extra payday. However, when I arrived at the given address, I was more than a little bit surprised to find that it was the oh-so-familiar home of the mystery man from my childhood. I slowly rolled up the long gravel driveway, suddenly trepidatious about meeting the man that I'd been told to avoid my whole life. Finally, I reasoned with myself that surely the resident must simply be an old shut-in, and I scolded myself for being irrational and almost avoiding a perfectly good customer based on childhood gossip. I knocked on the sturdy door of the farmhouse, and after a few moments, the door swung open to reveal an elderly gentleman of about 80 years old. I introduced myself, and he hobbled shakily out of the house to show me the stumps that needed to be removed. I gave him my estimate for the cost, and he nodded slowly. That'll be fine. When can you start? The sooner the better, he said. We shook hands on a date and a price, and as I got back in my truck to leave, I thought to myself that he seemed far less scary than all the rumors might have suggested. Although, as I looked over my shoulder to back down the driveway, a flash of movement from the tree line caught my eye. It was only for a second, but I could have sworn I saw a person's face staring out at me from behind one of the trees at the edge of the yard. I had always been told the man lived alone, but I figured it wasn't really that odd for someone to be visiting, right? Maybe it was one of his out-of-town grandchildren exploring the woods, just like I had always done as a kid. I returned a few days later. The stubborn walnut stumps proved no match for my old D7. When I was done, I knocked on the door and informed the owner that I'd finished early, so I'd be billing him for fewer hours of work than anticipated. He smiled dryly and thanked me for my honesty, offering to pay me extra for finishing the job so fast. I initially assured him that it was really no big deal, but then he made me a very tempting offer. He asked if I would like to come and hunt on his land. It was the height of deer season at the moment. I was definitely interested, since his entire 250-acre property was ringed with barbed wire fences and no trespassing signs. In fact, everybody I knew avoided the place due to the rumors and stigma surrounding the owner, and that meant that I would probably have a chance at some pretty nice deer if I took him up on the offer. I eagerly accepted and thanked him for the opportunity, and as soon as I had a free weekend, I headed out onto the land. Nearly the entire property was covered in dense forest and pine thickets, so this wouldn't be the usual post up in a tree stand and wait sort of hunt. This would rather be a real old-school deer stalking. It couldn't have been more than 40 degrees that day, and to make things worse, it was misting rain. It was great weather for hunting, but it certainly made me grateful for my thick clothing and warm socks. I followed a tangle of game trails through the thick woods, seeing plenty of deer tracks, even a few fairly large ones, all leading deeper and deeper into the pines and cedars. I should also mention that the woods were incredibly calm and peaceful, as the gloom and chill of the rainy November day had practically put the entire forest to sleep. In fact, other than the occasional rustle of a small animal dashing through the damp underbrush, the only noises were my own footsteps and the soft pitter-patter of raindrops. The rest of the day passed in much the same way. But by 5:15, it was starting to get too dark to continue. So I decided to turn around and start making my way back to the truck. Luckily, the rain had almost stopped, but a thick fog now hung in the damp evening air. I carefully retraced my steps as the woods became darker and darker. However, just when I was about to pull out my flashlight, I noticed that mine were no longer the only footsteps in the twilight thicket. I stood very still, listening to the movement in the brush as something drew closer. The footfalls were too loud to be deer, and besides, even a herd of deer is careful and methodical as they move, pausing regularly and picking their way around any obstacles. In contrast, these footsteps were reckless and constant, and I could hear twigs and low-hanging limbs cracking. This, I realized, was the sound of another person traipsing through the woods. I quietly crouched and hunkered down behind the base of a large poplar tree, making myself small in its shadow. I was worried that whoever was coming might have been a poacher, and I certainly did not want to catch a bullet due to being mistaken for an animal in the murky darkness. As the footsteps grew closer, I realized there was definitely more than one person out there in the fog, and even worse, I couldn't tell exactly what direction they were coming from. I could hear voices too, at least 2, maybe 3, but they sounded muffled, distorted in the thick mist. I held my breath as I listened closely, and I leaned out from behind the tree just enough to look in the direction of the noise. There, about 20 yards away, was the soft glow of an old incandescent flashlight bobbing through the fog, and silhouetted in that light, I could see 3 nightmarish figures. At first, I couldn't even make sense of what I was seeing. The 3 silhouettes looked alien and bizarre, each one an amalgamation of human and animal features. However, on closer inspection, I realized the mysterious shapes were actually people. Strange people. The one in front was wearing a deer's skull and antlers on top of its head, as well as a hooded cloak made from crudely cut animal skin. It also carried what looked to be a shovel over its shoulder, and in its hand it held the flashlight responsible for the glow. The second and third figures stood close together, and they both wore a collection of coyote tails like bandoliers across their bodies, along with coyote skulls adorning their hoods. As I squinted to look more closely, I could see that they were carrying something between them. It was a large tarp or sack, and judging by how the 2 coyote men handled it, it was heavy. As I watched the surreal column move wordlessly through the undergrowth, there was suddenly a loud rustling in the brush behind me. I snapped around, struggling to bring my rifle to bear, but when I turned to face the noise, I saw that it was only a fat possum. The little thing just stared at me for a few moments before dashing away back through the woods, but I guess the noise of its passing had gotten the attention of the 3 animal men, because when I looked back around the tree, the one with the deer antlers had turned back and began to walk in my direction. I held my breath, making myself as small as possible behind the poplar. I silently flipped my rifle's safety off. The deer man drew closer and closer, and the ground on either side of my hiding place was bathed in the yellow glow of the flashlight. My blood thrummed in my ears as my heart beat faster and faster. I didn't know for sure if these people would be hostile, but I wasn't about to pop out and introduce myself all the same. The footsteps of the deer man were very close now, and if I listened carefully, I could make out the sound of breathing on the other side of the tree. However, just when I was sure it was about to come around the tree, I heard one of the coyote men call out in the distance. I couldn't tell quite what he said, but I could make out the word heavy, so I assume he was complaining about whatever he was carrying. The light suddenly disappeared as it was pointed back in the other direction, and the footsteps again receded into the distance. I must have waited a good 5 or 10 minutes before getting up from the hiding place, unsure of whether or not the bizarre trio had truly left. But when I poked my head around the tree, they were indeed gone. I wanted nothing more than to get the heck out of there as soon as possible, but I couldn't help going and having a quick look at where they had passed. It didn't take me long to locate their footprints, and much to my relief, all 3 sets I found were normal shoe prints. No giant hooves or paws. However, as I shone my flashlight on the ground and investigated the footprints, something else caught my eye. Right in the middle of the trail the 3 of them had left, there was a glistening splotch of red-brown liquid that couldn't be anything but blood. I pointed the flashlight further down the trail, and sure enough, there were more drops and splotches. Further still, there was even a large puddle where the coyote men had stopped as the deer men had backtracked, looking for me. A feeling of nausea brewed in my stomach as I realized the implications of this. I quickly doused my flashlight to avoid broadcasting my presence. Now filled with a rising panic, I got moving back toward the trailhead as quickly and quietly as possible. The rain had started again, and in the foggy darkness, I could barely see a few feet in front of me. Even so, I only pulled my flashlight out when I absolutely had to, in case those people were still prowling around. Finally, I stumbled out of those woods at about 7:45, and I hastily jumped in my truck, pulling back onto the road. I was pretty focused on getting out of there, but as I drove past the farmhouse, I noticed none of the lights were on. There were no other cars in the driveway either, so whoever I'd seen in the woods hadn't come in by that route. Once I was safely home, I called the sheriff's office and anonymously reported that I had seen some suspicious men in those woods. I did not mention the animal skin cloaks or the various pelts and skulls. I have no idea if there was ever an investigation, but nothing ever showed up about it in the local paper. As far as I know, no bodies were ever found too, and no arrests were made. But I can tell you for certain that there are places in those woods where something could hide and never be found. For the rest of the season, I did not go back there, and I'm not sure if the man's offer was good for more than one season. Even if I got the chance, I don't think I would go back there alone. However, at least now I think I understand all those warnings from my childhood. I don't think all the neighbors were really that concerned about the old shut-in. I think they knew about those people using his land for God knows what, and they wanted to keep me and the other children in the area safe from ever wandering into something we shouldn't. After all, who knows what somebody that disturbed in the head would do to a witness in the woods?